And these black cats, the text tells us, are the forms taken by the demons there waiting to take his soul when he expires.
Okay. Magic, witchcraft, and black cats. 3 things that maybe you don't think are that connected to the Bible. Hey, I'm Jordan, and this is the Bible and Archaeology podcast, the place for conversations and questions about the lands, civilizations, and archaeology of the Bible. This week, we're going to be starting in the Bible before going a little bit further afield to see where do these traditions that connect magic and witches and black cats to Satan and demons come from? What are the biblical roots? How do things get reinterpreted? What do we need to know that we miss out on because of the context that we look at these things through? To help me through these questions, I've got Dr. Peter Miller back, who is a scholar on this and is very helpful in unpacking this material for you. Remember, for early access to ad-free video podcasts and exclusive bonus content like a bonus podcast, you can join us over on Patreon. We are Bible and Arc on Patreon. You can also now get the bonus episodes here on YouTube through our YouTube memberships. But for now, settle in, and I hope you enjoy our conversation all about magic, witchcraft, black cats, the Bible, demons, Satan, kissing of cat buttholes. We go into some weird corners. I think you're going to enjoy it. Dr. Peter Miller, so great to have you back. Happy to be able to see you and chat with you again. It's October. I feel like this is always the time I reach out and say, hey, Peter, do you want to come talk about some weird stuff? Because people have questions about weird stuff. So thank you for coming back.
Yeah, glad to be back. Excited to get to still participate. Strange to not be in the studio with you, but we are adjusting to the changes in time and space that have occurred.
And the beauty of the internet means you are in Virginia, but we can be together here. And everyone, as we said, Peter might be gone from us in body, but not in spirit, still around for your questions. And here with something very October, maybe a little bit surprising for some people, saying, Bible and archaeology, why are we talking about witches, magic, and cats? What is the biblical connection? Because sure, it's October, I get it. However, there's a surprising number of biblical undercurrents for some of this. Some that I think people maybe understand, and some that people have maybe a wild misunderstanding of what the text really says. So can we start all the way at the ground floor before getting to the really fun stuff? If we back all the way to the text itself, to the biblical text. When we're talking about what the Bible has to say about magic, where do you start?
So the easy place is probably some of the kind of prohibitions of magic in the Hebrew Bible. There are the famous passage in Exodus, you will not suffer a witch to live, a common translation. There are passages in Deuteronomy and Leviticus forbidding sorcery and witchcraft and consultation with spirits. And so it looks on the ground level like the Bible is very much against magic. But the challenge becomes, A, what do they even mean by these kinds of magic? And B, how do we get from what an ancient Israelite is thinking about when they imagine magic and wizards and witches compared to our modern tropes and ideas? And so how do we connect those dots to get to the point where the Bible says do not suffer a witch, and now we're imagining the Wicked Witch and Wizard of Oz with warts and green skin and your stereotypical Halloween witch. There is a long winding path there that has its roots in the Bible and is informed by a lot of people trying to navigate using the Bible. But we're going to have to talk a little bit about local polytheistic practices, the kinds of magical and religious traditions of both the ancient Near East, modern day Israel and the Levant, as well as some, European traditions that will be what medieval peoples are imagining and working with. Because it turns out when you keep trying to use the same word to describe different things happening in different cultures, things can get messy.
Yeah, there can be a little bit of slippage in how we're using the term. And I think, as you rightly point out here, there is such a baked-in image in our minds that brings all of these things. When you hear the term magic or you hear the term witch, something can immediately press forward, but it is very far removed from, as you say, the ancient Israelite context is not just in time, but like in almost every way, a completely different world when we're talking about this. So if you were to try to explain that context to someone, to say, set aside the Wizard of Oz for a moment, and I want you to imagine this as what they are talking about when they mention magic, or who they're talking about, or practices, where do you start to do that reframing?
Yeah. So the easy place to start is actually conveniently something that Bible and Archaeology has already done a full episode on. Our most protracted instance of these kinds of magical practices is the Witch of Endor.
Such a wonderful story.
It's great. And I want to cue in on just a couple key ideas of that story for our discussion today. And that's most notably like what it is that the witch in question, this sorceress, is actually doing. Because what she's doing lines up with a lot of ancient magical traditions in that ultimately she's trying to access knowledge through supernatural means. In the study of magic, we would call this broadly a kind of divination. This is going to borrow the Greek word manteia, a kind of prophetic work. And so anytime you see a magic that ends in mancy, in English, that is coming from that Greek root manteia. And so what we would categorize the Witch of Endor as doing is necromancy, or gaining of knowledge through consultation with the dead, the necros. So what we're really seeing here is attempts to acquire this information. And this isn't just done with the dead. When you sacrifice an animal and observe its liver, this is another kind of divination. When you swirl tea leaves and try to look at the base of a cup and see what it is, that's a kind of divination. When you try to read the stars and predict what's going to happen to you, or check the newspaper for what the professional astrologers tell you, this is also a kind of divination. Now, part of the reason the Witch of Endor is interesting is because it is in a world. This is the kingdom of Israel near the end of the reign of Saul, but still under Saul's laws, in which, in accordance with things like Deuteronomy 18, all kinds of practices of witchcraft have been forbidden. Legally, they're not allowed to practice. And the witch knows this and is like, hey, look, I'm not supposed to be doing this. And he's like, no, don't worry, you'll be safe. So she does anyway. And I think the key thing to note here is it works.
Right.
Like what the witch does works. It
works.
There's a long interpretive tradition that we should be aware of here. Did it work because God wanted it to teach Saul a lesson? Was it actually the shade of Samuel that emerges, or is it an angel that has appeared to convey this message condemning this? Because the witch describes what emerges as a god, like it's Elohim, like it is a god who has appeared from here. Your translations probably smooth that out to a divine figure. I think that's what the NRSV goes with in the updated edition, and it's a wonderful sidestep of the question of what's happening.
Yeah, well, and even the term witch itself in, the little subtext headers that you'll have in your Bible, where it's the Witch of Endor, which is the name that commonly gets used for this, itself has this long and heavily weighted down history, because in the text, right, she's a woman who performs this task, let's say, but isn't so much framed like as a witch in the way we might be thinking of witchcraft coming in. So in this path where you're saying, she's performing necromancy and doing some of these divination tasks, is that line of her then being identified as a witch fair on the basis of other things like Exodus and Deuteronomy? Or is that kind of the imposition of these later frameworks that we are bringing in as readers, somewhere in between?
So I think it is in line with Exodus, but the connotations we bring to what it means to be a witch are on us. So I want to read a short description of Deuteronomy 18's prohibitions, because I think it's important to note that it's not like magic as a single category is what's being forbidden here. So let me read this short passage from Deuteronomy 18, starting with verse 9 here. We'll go through about verse 14 or so, depending on when I get bored. When you come into the land that the Lord your God is giving you, as we're speaking to the Levites in particular, we're addressing the Levites, you must not learn to imitate the abhorrent practices of the nations. No one shall be found among you who makes a son or daughter pass through fire, who practices divination, or is a soothsayer, or an augur, or a sorcerer, or one who casts spells, or who consults ghosts or spirits, or who seeks oracles from the dead. Those are all separated with our conjunctive verbs here. You shall not be this or this or this or this or this, meaning all of these are something different. There's at least some connotation of difference here between a sorcerer and one who practices divination. But I want to continue just one or two more verses here to kind of encapsulate the image. So verse 12 continues, "For whoever does these things is abhorrent to the Lord. It is because of such abhorrent practices that the Lord your God is driving them out before you. You must remain completely loyal to the Lord your God. Although these nations that you are about to dispossess do give heed to soothsayers and diviners, as for you, the Lord your God does not permit you to do so." Now, what I take away from that as a reader here is that the abominable thing in question is not necessarily the actions themselves to try to gain knowledge of the future. It is in line with what we see in other Levitical laws and prohibitions, a kind of transgression of boundary. This is what the unchosen people have done. You will not do this. As the Philistines, as the Hittites, as whatever group it is, did, you will not do. It's this kind of establishment of boundary. And I think it's worth recognizing that some of the things being described here, like consulting stars for astrology, consulting ghosts, calling on them to cast spells, things that look a lot like those ways of manipulating spirits we talked about back when we discussed demons and the interaction of the supernatural. A lot of these are ritual and religious practices of these polytheistic nations around what is now the modern day Israel, but then the ancient kingdom of Israel, as the tribes establish themselves, as the monarchy comes into existence. I read these in part as a kind of like cultural and religious prohibition of you don't get to do these things. And I think we see evidence for this in particular because this exact catalog of things, consulting sorcerers and spirits of the dead, making sons or daughters pass through fire, what does our wayward king of Second Chronicles do but exactly these things under the influence of foreign priests?
Yes. When it's going through these lists, as you mentioned, right, it's a lot of these particular actions. Don't do this, don't do this. Why so specific in the categorization rather than going for kind of a blanket term? Like, it's not just don't do magic. It's here's a listing of things, and it doesn't specify then even within that, though, like, okay, when we're saying sorcery, well, what do we mean by that? It doesn't give you the how-to guide of, well, these are the things. Why does it pick that path through?
So I think part of what we need to recognize is there are different kinds of action taking place. We also have the limit of we don't actually know some of the specifics of what goes into these Hebrew words. Some of these only appear in these prohibition lists, and we don't get a description of what it means to do these. Some of them, when they do appear, do help us see a little bit. And so like that word for sorcerer, for example, that's going to show up again in Exodus, describing those rival court magicians of Pharaoh who are contesting with Moses and Aaron. And they do what in the Greek magical tradition we might call something closer to thaumaturgy or wonder working. They're able to do seemingly impossible things that mimic or look a lot like the performing of miracles that God enables. When, the staff is cast down and turns into a snake, great. You've worked a miracle, you've worked a marvel. You are a thaumaturge, but these other magicians can do that too.
Mm-hmm.
Now, whether they can do that because they are, successfully able to manipulate the supernatural world around them through their study and formula, whether they are under the thrall of demons, as later interpreters would say, it's the demons who give them the power to work something that mimics miracles. Whatever the case may be, they are doing these wonders. And it's that kind of tension where they are performing the work that we see going on. And this is different than acquiring the kinds of knowledge that we're seeing in these kind of divinatory practices. So we can see different ways that these might be prohibited and for different reasons. These thaumaturgical acts, these transformations of things, the miraculous creation of something, one might think, the production of water from a stone or something. Like, this is a miraculous event. Is this being prohibited because it is a usurpation of reliance on God specifically? You are turning to other sources. Is it a religious transgression because priests of foreign peoples are doing this? The acquisition of knowledge might also be an infringing on claims about only God gets to know the future, only God gets to know these secret details. But I also want to highlight this question of the transgression of these kinds of ritual boundaries, especially in the Deuteronomistic laws. There's a lot of worry about keeping categories separate. And one of the most important categories of separation is the living from the dead.
Mm-hmm.
And what does a medium, someone who can consult a spirit like the Witch of Endor, do but purposefully and meaningfully transgress that boundary to then permit this consultation? And it might be in transgressing that separation of category, living from dead, animal from human, divine and human, that boundary transgression may be part of what we're wrestling with as part of its prohibition. And that's different than you can turn a stick into a snake.
If we have that in the one hand, I think Witch of Endor is a solid example, and some of the others, as we have in Exodus, for some categories of magical activity or behaviors from the Hebrew Bible. If we turn then to the New Testament, I think probably the first thing that jumps into people's minds is, well, aren't there a group of magi or something that show up, immediately at the beginning here, marking the birth of a individual? So how does the New Testament join the conversation of what the Hebrew Bible had been doing when talking about magic or magicians to, I guess, give us part two here of the underlying framework from which people build?
Yeah. So the interesting thing the New Testament does is, in many ways, it kind of picks up the ball and runs with some of these baseline assumptions that we have seen in the Hebrew Bible. We've seen them grab the idea of foreign wise men, in this case, the Magoi, the Magi. These are Persian astrologers. This is what they are. They're part of a foreign religious group who consults with the stars and uses these to understand. This is why they notice a strange and miraculous star and predict what it means here. We see this picked up in later literature as well, with the emphasis on equating the Chaldeans with astrological groups. And in this way, I think the New Testament is actually picking up on some of the moves that later Hebrew texts like Daniel are making, where the astrologers, the Chaldeans, become a more important part of the Babylonian court. So I think in a lot of ways they want to have that continuity with Daniel. So we see them pick up on that foreignizing element, but they put a little twist on it. When we see someone like the Magi appear in the Gospels, it kind of has this notice of, here is a Gentile group who recognizes the specialness of Jesus, of the Messiah. And so we might be starting to play with those questions of categorization of who is the chosen people. Is this message just for Jews, or does it extend to Gentiles as well? And which of them and from when? So we're seeing that ethnic question in play very early in the Gospels already. But the other thing that they do pick up on is, in a lot of ways, they start picking up hints from that Greek magical tradition we've been talking about. And we see more Greek-style magicians and thaumaturges in play, probably and most famously the case of Simon Magus. Simon Magus, from the book of Acts, of course, contends with, in part, St. Peter. But the story that is actually preserved in Acts for us is much, much less explicitly he's a bad guy than it looks. He starts as a magician. He starts as a thaumaturge. He's going around and he's working wonders. He is doing things that are making people think that he's, somehow divine. This is in line with all kinds of accounts of men who wander the Eastern Mediterranean, performing semi-miraculous deeds and acquiring a following for themselves that we see in the Greek magical tradition. For the readers or for watchers who aren't familiar, highly recommend reading the story of Apollonius of Tyana, a Greek wonder worker who gets threatened with and nearly put to death by the Roman Empire for being an evil mage and is miraculously saved. Wonderful set of texts. In many cases, people have questioned how related this is to the genre of the gospel as we get in the case of Jesus. But, so it's not unheard of. People wander around in the same way that there were other people claiming the title of Messiah at the time of Jesus's ministry. There are other people going around saying they can go do special miraculous deeds, whether that's controlling spirits, predicting the future, turning stuff into food, healing people. This is a whole category of person who wanders the ancient world. But then here's this guy who's working magic, and he sees the apostle Philip perform even greater deeds. And he converts. He gets baptized. He's super into this whole Jesus movement thing. And then he witnesses the laying on of hands, and he goes to Peter and he says, "This is amazing. How much do I have to pay you to receive the laying on of hands so that I too can go do this?" And Peter is affronted. This is horrific. This is, how dare you suggest you can purchase this divine gift? And he gets cursed. And the last thing we hear from Simon Magus in the Bible itself is him asking Peter to pray for him so that he will not deserve the curse that has just been uttered against him. He's not this wicked demon manipulating evil guy. He, in line with how ancient magicians largely worked, assumed you had to pay for access to the most powerful materials because no teacher gives that away for free.
Right. So if we have this somewhat complicated biblical context, whether you're looking at the Hebrew Bible or the New Testament, not super clear-cut, but there's definitely presence. There's condemnation. There's instances where there are stories, maybe with less condemnation than we might expect, or if we read them carefully, with less laden on them. If we move forward in time, a significant jump ahead, how do we go from the Witch of Endor and from Simon Magus and those descriptions of the biblical understanding of magic and magicians and working of wonders to witch hunts? Because the thing people probably most associate with, verses like those Exodus and Deuteronomy traditions is potentially their use in those types of events. So what happens that leads us to go from one somewhat cloudy description to one very troubling sequence of events?
Yeah, so this is where we get into a really messy kind of history, and I'll try to kind of keep the trajectories here, but I want to highlight as is always the case with early Christianity, what we're dealing with is a variety of local traditions trying to be a universalizing thing, but local practices will vary in some cases. So we're going to sketch a broad trajectory, knowing that there will be local places where this is different. So with that catalog in mind, part of what we're seeing is the character of the sorcerer becomes a kind of go-to threat character. As Christianity spreads through Europe, through North Africa, eastward into Asia, it is encountering indigenous religious practices, whether we're talking about, the worship of Odin the Aesir among the Norse, whether we're talking, traditional Celtic deities in the British Isles, whether we're talking about, some of the local North African practices, the remnants of syncretized ancient Egyptian religion, or some of the, Asian steppe cultural practices, some of the animisms and ghost consultations we see there. We're seeing that impulse that, again, when we talked about with the question of demons, is how do we make sense of a world where people are worshiping these other things? And so cataloging them, categorizing them as, the work of the enemy, of Satan, is an easy way to fall into this. It's an easy kind of story to tell. We can point to the influence of demons as the heads of idols, as manipulating and tricking people, the same way that we saw done with the gods of Greece and Rome. They become a way to handle that. Now, once the kind of gospel message gets there and conversion efforts are underway, you have this kind of Christian, and I don't like the term, but I will broadly use the term pagan here, this kind of broad polytheistic variety of traditions that becomes a default opponent. But you also, especially after the kind of institutionalization of Christianity following its legalization under Constantine, following the establishment of these, in theory, universal declarations at Nicaea and Chalcedon and these other major church councils, you have concerns about this growing category of the heretic, the person who is purposefully teaching or acting against the directives, the doctrine of the church. And it is in the kind of equation of the worshiper of a false god and a perverter of the church of the false god that we see this notion of service to a demonic enemy become the kind of unifying factor. So we kind of hybridize the polytheistic religious person, any practices that don't cleanly align with our cultural expectation of what is a normal kind of procedure. Sure, you can pray for rain, but you can't write a spell out to cause rain. And exactly where that line is navigable within culture. And so we'll come back to that here in a second. But then you also have this threat that the church might have internal enemies, right? So all of these are assumed in this kind of binary structure of you serve God or you are a minion of Satan, to ultimately have their wellspring from the great enemy here. And so you see the witch become a kind of easy stand-in for a variety of these kinds of features.
In this blending together of so many different concerns and elements and traditions, is there some unifying thread that leads to that concern becoming particularly gendered towards the witch? Because as we laid out here from the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament, okay, we have a Witch of Endor story, but then you're also putting forward Simon Magus as, another. And not all of these listings of things are, particularly gendered within the text itself. Sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. Is there some concern that underlies and leads to that turn itself?
I don't think there's a like clean singular, like this is the moment it happens that we can identify. But I think we have a kind of through line in these largely patriarchal ancient structures, where the head of household is a man, the clergy are men. There is this broad suspicion in many cases of these wise women who are collecting herbs and using them for varieties of purposes, who are, doing domestic tasks, and that might include things like rituals. This may go back to some of the impulses of Levitical codes forbidding marriage of foreign women, because women bring their household gods with them. Women tend and maintain these lineages of tradition. They have jurisdiction over the home, but they're also, in many ways, threats. They are raising children. Their influence can sway people. We can look at the story of King Solomon, swayed away by his love of women in many ways. We can look at the influence of someone like Jezebel in the stories of Chronicles, as here's a woman who used her feminine wiles to woo away an otherwise righteous man to this wicked pathway. Now, I'm very sympathetic to Jezebel as a character. I think she gets a bad rap. But it's worth noting that through a lot of even like the early modern period into the 1800s, like calling someone a Jezebel is a deep insult, because it implies all these things. She's, sexually promiscuous. She is out of place in her work here. But even through the medieval period, what these women do, often without or against the permission and authority of the men around them, may be perceived as a threat to the largely patriarchal structures of power around them. They are expressing agency outside regular structures. And sometimes, you just have to recognize that, especially in the medieval period, when you have nominally celibate men being the ones in charge of the church here, we have potentially some baked in misogyny or sexual frustration that may be playing out. Maybe I'm biased by being the right age to, be deeply scarred by the Hunchback of Notre Dame when it came out in Disney's animated version. And I'm just picturing the Hellfire song in all the wrong ways here. But, we need to be aware of who's writing these prohibitions, and it's coming from male power structures,
right,
who are concerned with the ways women could exert authority. We see this echoed not just in Christianity. I don't want to fully say this is just Christianity or even monotheism's fault. The concerns that the Greeks had about witches, the concerns the Romans had about witches, are in many cases about those expressions of power. Medea is dangerous because she can manipulate men. And she is seen as kind of the witch, the pharmakeia par excellence. So it's not a uniquely monotheistic, it's not a uniquely Christian thing, which is why I think that's kind of that through line of the patriarchal suspicion of women finding expressions of power for themselves.
Do these types of names and texts play like a forward and prominent role in the literature? Because as you're mentioning, there are particular individuals that are associated with the development of these systems of thought, the witch hunts themselves, the legislation, the procedures, all of that becomes very textualized as this goes on. Do these names and Bible references and stories make their way in there in a way that we can see and identify? Or do they kind of serve as that, this is the water in which these individuals are swimming, and so it might be harder to see, this is the reference that they're pointing to, and it's more of just their general cultural background?
What we really see play out, especially when we get to the period of the Inquisition, where we're going to start seeing the texts that will come to define the witch hunt being written. When we get there, we see a lot of specific invocation and reference to these points of danger. these specific characters, but in line with like what to watch for. You know some of the story of Jezebel. Here's how to find the Jezebel in your village,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so they're taken as these kinds of, I would say, like almost instructive examples of these broad categories. Now, what's particularly interesting are the ways that these categories don't always line up with what we as modern readers identify as their key features. They seem to be adding additional details. One of the things we see entering the lexicon, especially around like the 13 and 1400s, and this is partly where we come to that question of cats in particular, is the dawn of this notion of like the familiar, this like animal companion
Right.
to a spellcaster that is somehow tied to what it is that they do. And we really see that come to prominence again, like the 1300s and 1400s, probably reflecting some of these other earlier traditions of one of the witch's abilities to transgress certain boundaries to acquire knowledge being the ability to talk or transform into animals. Things going all the way back to our Roman exempla.
So when you're saying here that there are certain texts that begin to define the systems of thought and the things that will shape, I think in some ways still continue to shape people's thought of this. If we've already laid out some of the biblical materials, what is kind of this next category of materials that we don't have to fully get into the weeds in today,
Sure.
but are some of the things people need to have in their mind to say, okay, in order for us to get to, cats, how do we go from biblical references, which seem to say nothing about cats in any of these lists, into such a well-defined relationship between witches and black cats that persists?
Yeah. So let's talk briefly about the cats question, and then I'll kind of lead us into where we go from there. So, like as you mentioned, like there's not a lot of cats in the Bible. Now, I mean, you can search all you want. The cats that are there are broadly like large predatory cats, panthers, lions, that sort of thing. You'll see references there. The one that is particularly important, though, comes from one of the letters of Peter, where the author of this epistle writes, discipline yourselves, keep alert. Like a roaring lion, your adversary, the devil, prowls around looking for someone to devour. So we have a biblical basis for associating the devil with something vaguely feline, but a lion is not a house cat.
Right. It feels like a pretty soft place to build this argument from.
Yeah. But we can look to, especially we're thinking here kind of continental Europe in the kind of medieval period. So we're thinking 11, 1200s especially. We're going to see a lot of sermons, a lot of storytelling, pick up on this notion of cats are in some ways just more potentially evil or more aligned with Satan than some other animals. The way we see this played out in particular is in this symbolic view. People watch cats. Cats were prized in many ways for the fact that they hunt mice in a world before the invention of the mousetrap. Very important for keeping food healthy. But for anyone who's had a cat, and I can speak from experience from my own cat here, I know, Jordan, you have some cats, you've probably seen this too. When they catch a mouse, they don't just, quickly and mercifully kill it. They have a tendency to toy with it, to play with it as part of their hunt. And we see medieval texts use the language of metaphor to describe Satan's toying with the soul of a sinner like a cat toying with a captured mouse. The mouse can never fully escape once it's in the claws of the cat, but the cat might let it go and run just a little bit before it snares it back and it wounds it further. In the same way, our medieval European authors are imagining that this is how Satan plays with human souls. And this seems to pick up on, I think, some of the accounts of demons and Satan transforming into animals to attack monks in our earlier 3rd, 4th, and 5th century monastic lives and biographies. Athanasius's Life of Anthony, for example, describes him being just mauled by beasts, but it's never purely being attacked by beasts. There's also the more subtle means of worming your way in through these kind of seductive and trickery methods. So you've got this, devil as hunter of souls. The devil is, out like a cat on the prowl trying to capture it. And when you frame it that way, where there's not wild lions in Europe, but you have this feline word, what do they have to picture? They have house cats and they have feral cats. I also want to point out the medieval world did not know very well what the heck was up with cats. One of my favorite...
What do you mean? What do you mean they don't know what's up with cats?
There were debates about if they were reptiles.
Reptiles?
Yeah. On the most fascinating little caveat. So if you've gotten scratched by a cat, it puffs up, it gets infected, it looks pretty gnarly, especially in a world before you have distilled water to wash it out, right? So the question was, that doesn't happen with other animal scratches. Are cats venomous? And the things we know are venomous are reptiles.
Interesting.
And so there's this, I think it's an 11th century or so English text about feral cats, English in the region, not in the language. This text about, knowing the dangers of feral cats and, this question of their venomous scratches and things. We don't have our modern biological categories where, we're imagining cats descended from wild cats that have been bred to be domestic. But you've also got the reality that even domestic cats, not that domesticated.
Yeah.
They're very willful. They're hard to train. They don't obey you like a dog does. And so thinking back to these questions of denials of patriarchal structure and a refusal to adhere to, the hierarchy, literally the holy order, the holy leadership here, is what hierarchy means. Cats are challenging to fit into this. They're willful. They don't really care what you want them to do most of the time. They're fickle. And if you're worried about women behaving in this way, there's a kind of natural affinity from an outside perspective that these cats are behaving the way these women are.
Why black cats in particular? Is there something in this literature that's discussing the cats, whether they be domesticated or feral, that picks out that look of cat as, especially prone to these types of associations?
So there's a few different lines here. And I want to explore them through a fascinating little medieval story that I think really highlights what's going on with some of these cats. And we can interrogate the pieces here. So there's a story from I believe the version we have comes from the early 1300s. It might be reflective of a precedent from the 1200s here. There are two people dying in a town. And there is a wealthy priest and a greedy priest and a very pious deacon. The greedy priest goes to the deathbed of a rich man, there to tend him, but also to try to talk him out of his money. He's here to, I am serving you. Wouldn't it be great if you gave us all your money on your deathbed here? Imagine how good it would be for you. But he's motivated by greed. The pious deacon knows that there is a widow at the edge of town who is dying. And though she has nothing to give and he has nothing to gain from going, he goes to do his good religious duty to see her into the next life ahead. And once both of our clerics are off to their duty, we get to see who else is attending the deaths of these figures. The poor widow, of course, is tended by a pair of angels and the Virgin Mary herself. She is recognized for her virtue, and the pious deacon knows that he has made the right choice. He has done what is good and holy here. Whereas when the greedy priest gets to the dying rich man's deathbed, he is surrounded by, in some later manuscripts, it's a group of specifically 13 black cats. And these black cats, the text tells us, are the forms taken by the demons there waiting to take his soul when he expires.
Okay.
So, why black cats in this particular group? Going back to our earlier monastic literature, there's, through some like apocalyptic language and coding, it's not hard to imagine black as a color associated with evil. We see this in a lot of the kind of like early Christian and late antique apocalyptic literature. A pure white lamb is holy. A black goat is bad news. Red means the bringing of war. Like, we have this kind of color language in religious literature already coming out of the early Christian tradition. We have no reason to imagine that's being deeply, manipulated or moved here, especially for people who are holding these texts as sacred. We might have, as we see the cat sitting there waiting to, take the soul as he goes, we might have that kind of toying with their prey mentality that we've been talking about. But I think it's also important to note the association and dangers of night as a feature here, and the kind of nocturnal nature of cats, and that often very creepy kind of reflection of their eyes in the dark. They are very at home in places that should be frightening and off-putting. They are just as at home in the darkness as they are in the light, and they have this quasi-occult looking thing of those reflective eyes. And nowadays we know what's going on in the phenomena there. It's nothing evil or magical. But if you're a pre-modern person and you're walking through the woods at night and you see these glowering eyes through the darkness periodically, that's pretty creepy. And that connection to things stalking in the dark, I think you don't know. Is that a cat? Is that a demon? Is there a difference?
So they line up with an unfortunate number of overlaps in concerns and characteristics and old traditions that mark them as particularly prone, because they seem like, it's a cat. It feels in some ways so random, but then at the other times, when you lay all these parts out, you go, okay, you don't have to agree with their associations here, but you can see the ways that they are building slowly to get to that particular thing. One aspect, though, that I've never understood how it gets built to in this association between, witches and cats and demons and devil is the kissing. The kissing that happens between, witches and be it a cat or the devil incarnate or something. For those who are saying, what is Jordan talking about here? Peter, can you talk to us about the kiss? What's going on?
So let me lay out a baseline before we get to what the Germans call the Katzenkusser, or the cat kisser. When we see the kind of affiliation of the witch and the heretic and all of these things in this assumed scenario, we also see cats becoming the default image for idols that are worshipped by heretics, by pagans. You see this in a couple different places. You see this in witch hunting manuals. I think one of the more interesting cases of this comes from the Winchester Bible, which is a 12th century manuscript that includes the Book of the Maccabees, which famously has the scene of the Greeks telling the Jews to sacrifice at a pagan altar. Now, Maccabees as a text does not tell us specifically what this, idol looks like. Just that, the patriarch of the Maccabee clan wants nothing to do with it and kills a man. Great. The Winchester Bible does show it, though, and the idol is shaped like a cat. by this period. It is a cat idol. And so perhaps drawing on this Epistle of Peter passage, perhaps drawing on this association with cats, the notion becomes that demons, and particularly Satan himself, will take on the aspect of a cat, especially in the midst of these kinds of dark rituals. They will come to be called black masses because they are evil perversions of the Christian ritual of the Mass, because the assumption from a lot of the church hierarchy is that their religion is the only and correct one, and so all others must look like it but distorted. And so they're clearly doing something like a Mass, but dedicated to Satan instead. And we see a perversion, perhaps, of Paul's call to greet fellow Christians with a holy kiss, to salute Satan. And so, in this perversion, we get this rampant medieval tradition that towards the conclusion of a witches' mass, the gathered heretics, witches, whatever you want to call them in this instance, approach the incarnate Satan in the form of a cat, and they kiss the cat, but they kiss the cat not on the mouth, but on the anus. They kiss the opposite end that you would expect, degrading themselves, profaning themselves, certainly, at least in the mindset of our, ancient Israelite texts, committing a great ritual impurity, if not a moral one here. But this becomes the case, and you'll see this in some early modern and late medieval texts of people kissing a cat under its tail. And this is what heretics do. And so the German word Katzenkusser, or cat kisser, becomes the kind of go-to insult for a heretic, to decry someone as opposed to the real religion.
Interesting. The holy kiss, I guess I had never thought that would play a role in this. But if all of the things are, you take something and you invert it, and you take something and you invert it, yeah, that makes sense that they would say, if you're supposed to do this, then yeah, you can't be coming up with something different to do. You have to be doing our thing, but wrong. So then you're kissing. Okay, that makes a little bit of sense. It doesn't make a ton of sense, but it makes some sense.
Well, and you need to recognize that obviously we don't have any record of this actually happening.
Right.
This is what this group of clerics perceives a group of opponents who may or may not actually exist to do. And so, you see like the Cathars, whose name is unfortunately close to cat, so they get particularly tied up in with this cat language of heresy. The Cathars get accused of these kinds of things. You see these groups pop up, but one of the things that I've come to understand is, as I study varieties of religious traditions in Christianity, none of these groups are purposefully pledging themselves to the devil. They're understanding their religion and their world in a different way. And so these schisms, these heretics, they're not actually going out and doing these things like, trying to collect the blood of the faithful for their perverted Eucharists. They're not trying to go out and do these things. Maybe some disgruntled people who are upset with the church are trying to find ways to profane things. But broadly, we're dealing with how a kind of conspiratorially minded clerical elite are imagining that they are facing a single united enemy that is out to undermine them and their holy structure, rather than thinking that these guys over here might have some legitimate complaints about the structure of the church and maybe disagree on some of our doctrine on, who does or doesn't get into heaven.
Yeah, that's something that there's no way they could just have a problem with things that are here. Instead, they're obviously kissing cats on the butt.
Yeah.
That has to be the answer.
Yeah. The bizarre actually becomes the simpler answer, right? It's a simplification to reduce all of your opponents, be they practitioners of local, pre-Wiccan tradition, ancient Norse paganisms, whatever the case may be, or people who are opposed to you on a variety of political or religious grounds, you can flatten all of that texture into heretics pledged to the devil attacking us from any angle they can find and perverting it. This is one of the great things about conspiracy theories to hold on to is they look bizarre and feel like they introduce so much, extra material. But at the end of the day, they're ways to try to take a complicated world and reduce it to one problem, one enemy. And you hold on to that simplification in many cases because the alternative is that you have to start questioning your own held beliefs and opinions. And in some cases, flattening everyone and everything else out is the easier thing to do.
I was going to ask here as we come towards our end, why you think some of these traditions still linger, but I feel like that is the answer of, well, if we have these perspectives, this can be a simpler approach that maybe the old stand-ins from whether it be the biblical text or the interpretations that have come through that over time. Is that what you think still allows a lot of this to linger? Is it like the power of the visual associations that come with this as well? Or just, people don't really believe in it and maybe it's overblown and, there's not really a fear of black cats anymore. And that does seem like something that's just, it's talked about, but it's not really a thing.
So, I mean, there still is this like fear and superstition around black cats. This is a thing to be aware of. I think we're dealing with it better in the modern world, but there are still shelters that won't let you adopt black cats close to Halloween out of fear of what people do to them. It's not when I first heard the statistic, I thought it was the Christmas puppy phenomenon of you buy a puppy for Christmas because you think it'll be fun. And then by Valentine's Day, you have another dog in a shelter because getting a puppy on Christmas was fun, but no one was ready for the work. And it turns out, no, one of the major concerns is that there are still people out there who want to harm black cats out of some kind of fear, and getting them through a shelter is a way to do that. I think part of the reason this persists, though, is when we talked about them a little bit at the top of this, but the witch trials of the 16th and 17th century, they cast a really long shadow. And for modern viewers, especially those who are inclined to or identify with witchcraft or pagan movements of the modern world, seeing what's happened to witches in that time period, the people who were hunted, whether it was in Salem or through the Inquisition in continental Europe or whatever the case may be, these witch trials, guided by seminal texts like the Malleus Maleficarum, the Hammer of the Witches of the kind of late 1400s, these witch hunting cases provide some of our best evidence for the most egregious things that witches and wizards are assumed to do, and show us the kind of unified enemy that is assumed in this. The Inquisition is nominally there to hunt and prevent heresy, but because witchcraft is defined by Heinrich Kramer as a form of heresy in the Malleus Maleficarum, we see this able to link up here. And the witch trials have just left such a long shadow of the threat that can be posed, the mass hysteria. We keep coming back to it. But also our modern media is still struggling with what to do with the figure of the witch, right? Even when we have a, benevolent kind of subversion of expectations, a character has a black cat, but it turns out that they're a lovely person. A character has a black cat and they are a magical practitioner, but they're the good guy. Sabrina the Teenage Witch has a black cat named Salem. I wonder where they got that name. We're still playing with that because the ultimate grappling we have to deal with here is that even when media is trying to subvert our expectations, they can only subvert an expectation that we already have, which means that we're still carrying certain views about witches and black cats, whether we're conscientious of them or not. Ideally, we're not doing so in a malicious way, but we need to be aware that we're not absent the like water we're swimming in. We're still breathing the air that associates certain things with witchcraft, with black magic, with these kinds of potential perceived dangers. Maybe we don't think about them as demonic in the same way, but certainly I know plenty of modern people who still think that, having a black cat cross your path is something that means they have to go knock on wood or do something lucky to subvert, because they think it's unlucky.
Can I ask here as we wrap up, this feels like a perfect cross connection to something that you were a part of, a film that will be coming out here shortly, or depending on when you watch this, is already out. Blacklisted. Can you talk a little bit about what this is, how it kind of connects into this, and for someone who is looking for more, what they might be able to find in that?
Yeah. So I was able to be interviewed. I was kind of one of the scholarly consultants for a short documentary called Blacklisted, which ultimately is a study of a fascinating little shelter and shop in North Carolina called the House of Black Cat Magic, where the owners, Hannah Soboleski and Star Bustamante, are running a cat shelter specializing in the care of and finding homes for black cats. But they found that the way that they were able to find success in that included expanding their shop to include and appeal to modern Wiccan and magical practices, including, the sale of tarot cards or incense and these things. They're doing some really, really interesting, fascinating work. They're doing a lot of good for these cats. And so the documentary team, which was funded by the Fetzer Institute, included the journalist Julia Pillard, our director and cinematographer Sullivan Slentz, and our managing editor Silma Suba. They went on location. They interviewed these people, got to know the cats. They talked about how the shelter was affected by the hurricane that went through a little over a year ago, some of the damage and reconstruction that's still going on. So part of my participation was in hopes of drawing attention to shelters like this that are trying to, specifically address the cultural stereotypes that are still harming some of these innocent animals. And so if anyone is so inclined, the House of Black Cat Magic is still, accepting donations to help offset the cost of rebuilding and running the shelter after that hurricane. And, they have a lot of work to do to keep these cats fed and healthy and find them homes. So, Jordan, you mentioned that we'll have some links available. You can also just go to their homepage, and the homepage will have just a donate button on the top there. Or you can just click through and see what kinds of cats they have, the work they're up to. Or if you're someone who is inclined to, buy a bundle of sage or, a new deck of tarot cards or the like, you can purchase from their shop digitally as well as on site. So I just hope that this gets some attention.
Links will be in the description or the show notes for both the film and to direct you towards the shelter itself if you are interested. As someone who is the adoptive parents of a 3-legged black cat out of a similar style of concern for where is this cat going to go, black cats need homes too. So if you're looking to adopt cats, take a look. There's lots of black cats around. Peter, thank you for walking us down this winding road of the Bible, witches, magic, and cats. I really appreciate your insight. I always love getting the chance to talk. So thank you so much for taking the time today to come and walk me through this.
Yeah, of course. Thanks so much for having me. And I'm sure we'll be chatting again sometime in the near future. Plenty of dangling threads for us to pick up on from this conversation.
Yeah, you just threw, the Malefice Maleficarum out there on the table. We throw that in at the end and we'll not talk about it. If you're interested in more, leave a comment. Maybe we can schedule something to come back around, but that's a whole other can of worms that we'll leave aside for today. So Peter, thank you, everyone listening or watching. Thank you so much for tuning in. Be sure to like and subscribe wherever you find us. It helps us. Hopefully it helps you stay in touch with us. But for this week, for all of us here at Bible and Archaeology, until next time.